All right, so to get started, we're going to start like sort of in the middle of where Rav Dessler starts to talk about Elul. Um, he spends like the first portion of this talking about Bechira, and if you remember, we talked about this. It's been a long time. This is probably like all the way back to like last fall, maybe even coming into winter time, like November, December time period. But we looked at how Rav Dessler understands Bechira, and where he talks about the idea that Bechira is really that point where we're still sort of fighting, right? We're still fighting the Yetzer on that. So, for instance, if we've been, sort of all our lives, or for a period of time at least, Shomer Shabbos, then for us, not hitting the light switch on Shabbos, there's not a lot of Bechira there. It's just not something that we feel that it's necessary to do. We don't have a strong desire to do it, etc. Somebody who didn't grow up that way, that might be exactly where their Bechira is, right? So he talked about that. And in the beginning of this piece on Elul, he talks about Bechira, and he talks about how, when you're at that point, whatever that is for you as an individual, why is it that sometimes we make the wrong choice, right? And he talks about it and he uses the terminology. He says it's pshia, that we are a poshea when we make that wrong choice. And so at this stage, and he spends quite a bit of time talking about that, but at this stage, what he's starting to get into, and I think this is really relevant for us, holding right in the middle of Elul, is, so what do we do? Like, how do we fight that urge, whatever it is? And he says, so pick it up here where it says, Ha'itza shinoi ma'aseh. And he says, Ma nucha lahatziv neged hashfilas ve'yarida b'madrin achet. So what can we do to sort of protect ourselves? Ha'itza yitzua hayashe yar behadam ba'asiyas maisim tovim od b'terem yavo l'nisyon rega ha'bechira. He says, really, what we have to do is, before you get to that point where you're having to make that choice, where that, I guess, that desire, whatever it is, sort of, comes to you, before that, we need to be engaging and doing a lot of activities, a lot of ma'asim tovim that I guess will counteract that. So, b'Kabbalas Torah amru Yisrael nasa v'nishma. So remember when we talk about, right, in Parshas Mishpatim, we have the famous phrase of Nasa v'nishma. It says, "B'nishma levad ein harbe toelas lebechira." If we had simply focused on nishma, meaning that we're going to learn, it's the intellectual pursuit. We're going to learn Torah, and that's what we'll do. He says that by itself, it doesn't provide a lot of help when it comes to those tough choices, right? Those tough situations or moments in time when we're sort of feeling this urge to sort of go one way or the other. He says, Ela b'shinoi ma'aseh. The only thing that really helps is physical action, is doing something, is some changing that. He says, "V'harbas ma'asim tovim mitoch hashinoi hazeh mitoch hislahavus ad shenasim lo hergel." He says we have to continue to do ma'asim tovim that would sort of make a change within ourselves, ignite that fire, and until it becomes something that is just we're used to. And I think maybe what he's hinting at is that sort of moves that point of Bechira away from whatever the issue is that you're facing right now. It says, Kechok va'az rak az. And only then, Yoilu Divri Musar Shishma, it's only then that learning Torah, learning Musar, etc., can actually make an impact on you. In order to change that outer, sort of habit that you've got into, in order to be able to recognize what's, the more pnimi, the thing that's that how you really feel inside, meaning that we all sort of have this feeling of wanting to connect and wanting to have a more spiritual self. How do we connect to that? He says through ma'asim tovim. So koha avodas Elul, he lisav lihislahev laharbus b'ma'aseh chizuk. And that's really the avodah he says in Elul, is that we want to try and ignite this into and increase the ma'asim and the chizuk that we do Mikotza ripoyon shahainu bo mikodam al kotza hashini shel his chazkus, so that we can bring ourselves away from the edge of, sort of the weakness, the weakened edge that we're on, and move to something where we have a lot more strength. And he says, he quotes, there's a famous piece in Shulchan Aruch that talks about during Aseres Yemei Tshuva that we should be much more careful about the specifics of different mitzvahs. To the effect, or to the extent that we actually take upon ourselves, maybe even chumras, that we know that we're not going to continue to keep during, afterwards, after Yom Kippur. Like the one example that's given in Shulchan Aruch is during Aseres Yemei Tshuva, we take upon ourselves not to buy paspalter, meaning it's not, it's bread that's kosher, but it's purchased from a non-kosher bakery, a non-Jewishly owned, I should say, non-Jewish owned bakery. It's kosher, it's not Jewish owned. So, buying those Thomas bagels as opposed to going to Emma's, right, and getting the pasi straw is what he's talking about. Says, why do we do this? We have to really ask ourselves this question. It seems very strange that why do I have to go out of my way to buy things to, sort of take on another standard that I know that I'm going to go back to those Thomas bagels after Yom Kippur anyway. Why would I do this during Aseres Yemei Tshuva? He says, Ella ha'inyan hu shebezeh huronu chachminu zal as derech hatshuva. This is actually something that he says is really the derech hatshuva coming from Chazal. That in order to create what he was talking about earlier, to create this sort of ignite in ourselves and to really strengthen ourselves, we have to really focus on Maisim Tovim and the Dikdukei mitzvahs, the intricacies, the hakpada, the chumras in mitzvahs, and how we observe them. Alpha Pisha dayan inam lefi madragasenu. Even though we know that we're not really holding there, and it's not going to be something that we're going to continue doing long term. Because having that wide swing from one end to the other is what actually has an effect on our hearts. And that's what sort of opens a possibility to a true tshuva within us. Once we do the naaseh, and we actually start to take on the mitzvos and maisim tovim and those sort of things, then we can go back to the nishma and actually start to learn. Rak bihis chazkus kazos efshar lavo lifnei hamelech dikonos v'sharet tshuva she Hashem yisbarach echin lanu b'chasadav le'inkates. And only with that sort of strengthening of ourselves are we able to enter into the Shai Tshuva, meaning the time period of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So he says he starts his chazkos shel Elul. So let's talk a little bit more in depth on this, and that's what he's going to get into. He says maho erchem shel maisim tovim chitzonim she'anu osim ito chergal bechinuch mibli sheyabatu hakara pnimis shel ratzon la'avodas Hashem. So asking that question further. So what does this mean exactly, and how do we do this? So betzinu shtei tshuvas ledavar lechora sosros hein zu lezu. So there's really two different ways to look at this, and they sort of contradict each other. Mitzad echad anu motzim shemaisim ke'elu chashuvim heim mikama ponim. Gvar bi'anu le'el b'hakdoma le'elo. Shebemaisim ke'elu anu makdimim es penei hara magvirim es chizukenu neged apshia shebebechira. So, as we mentioned earlier, he talks about this in more depth, beginning that we're trying to strengthen ourselves against this pshia in bechira, meaning making that wrong choice. really what we're trying to do is sort of build for ourselves a shield, and doing these Ma'asim Tovim become that shield for us. So Od Yoser, the other way, number 2, Od Yoser Mizeh Matzinu b'Mishnah da'Avos Yafo Talmud Torah im derech eretz shegias shnehem mishkachas avon. The Mishnah in Avos says that, famous Mishnah, right, that we should have Talmud Torah with derech eretz, because when you are engaged in both, that's how avon, that's how the chait is. That's how you avoid the chait. Hari she'afilu maseh derech eretz maseh olam hazeh mamish yesh biyagia hachrucha be'asiyasam koach lagim ba'afnei hayitzer hara. That somehow that really being engaged in those, just sort of worldly, mundane activities, that itself can actually protect us against the Yetzer Hara. So, M'maisa mitzvahs greda v'choshakim melibud haTorah kedosha efshar shetitzmach gam pnimius mitocha chitzonius. So he says, if we're just engaged in mitzvahs, that by itself is able to sort of grow within ourselves the panemius of it, within the chitzonius of doing the action itself. So what does he mean? Sorry, Hari Yadua Hetev Marmaram Zal Olam Yasuk Adam Betorah Mitzvos Afilu Shalosh Lishman Shmitoch Shalolishman Balishman. This is a famous Gemara, comes up in a couple of different places that the Gemara says that we should start to do things even if it's not lishma. And in other words, meaning that even if we don't completely believe it or really are really ready for it, we should still do it, because once we start to do it and we get ourselves accustomed to it, we'll come to doing it lishma, meaning for the sake of heaven, for the sake, for the right pupurposes. But here Yerushalmi, Lama Torah afilu shalol lishman shekeven she'ata misasek ba ata chozer ve'osa osa lishma. So the Yerushalmi has a slightly different girsa, but it sort of drives home that point a little bit more, that that as we go back and continue to do it, it becomes more lishma for us. V'hainu shemitoch shemisasek ba nikvas kedushas haTorah b'fnim ha'adam u'sha'ayidei kach misareres pnimios v'nisnotzitz bo or halishma. That as we're engaged in this, that really sort of solidifies the kedusha within ourselves. Or the other way to look at it is that it sort of wakes up within ourselves, and it sort of creates that spark. Either way you want to look at it, but that's the idea of what it's doing. So even when we start out with the wrong or not the best intentions, we can still end up having the right intentions as we continue to do these things over and over again. All right, shetov rav tamun gam b'maisim chitzoniim avav me'etzad hasheni motzim anu mispa ma'amarim shenirim keilu nogdim hem becharifos l'maisim keila. So he says, but wait a second here. He says, I'm going to point out a couple of places where it seems like we're seeing the opposite, that this is not, what we just said is not true. So the first example, he says, Hein Yeshayahu Navi Machriz Yan ki niga sha'am azeh befiv ubesfasav kabduni v'livim rachach mimeni v'tehi yerasem osib mitzvahs anashim malomda nini yosef lahafli apela upela uvavda chachmas chachmav Rubinas Nevonav Tistater. So the Navi Yeshayahu seems to be saying that the way that we are practicing our Yiddishkeit, the way that we're performing mitzvahs, is by rote, and we've sort of missed what the chachma behind it is, and we've lost our way of why we're doing what we're doing, and we're just sort of going through the motions. So if we're only doing it because we're used to it and that's how we were taught to do things, as habina Yisrael, she have vedas upon him. We lose the by doing it by rote, we lose what's the intrinsic good in it. And we see also that Hashem is not happy with the way that we are performing our mitzvahs when we do it in that way. And again, that seems to contradict what we saw up above in the Gemara. The second example that he brings is Yedua Ma'amarisha Avram Avinu, Olav Shalom. Ki amarti rak ein yiras Elokim b'makom hazeh v'haraguni ad dvar ishti. And this is where he's in front of the Plishtim, and he tells them that Sarah is his wife, and then they say to him, after Hashem gives them their whatever Magifo, or sort of wakes them up and says, don't go after his wife, and they come to Avram and say, what's going on here? Why'd you lie to us? Why'd you say she's your sister? So af shinis nahagu aplishtim kitzadikim k'moshe kosuf agoy gam tzadik taharet. The Plishtim, I think this is Evan Melech, right, comes back and says that you're gonna you through your words you're gonna end up having the tzaddik, us, we are righteous, and you're gonna have us killed because you didn't tell us the nature of the relationship with Sarah. They did it. They were polite. They had society. They had a certain culture to them. But what we see from Avram is that even though they had this, they had certain derech eretz to them, and yet we see that Avram is saying that you're not good. And he was concerned that they were literally going to become murderers, even though apparently they seem to have good manners. So why is it that if they truly have these cultural norms, why doesn't that permeate into their being, that they wouldn't take somebody's wife away from them? So again, same idea, that why is it, if and I guess just to ask that question maybe a little bit more directly, what Rav Dessler is saying is, why is it that the Plishtim, if they really sort of conduct themselves as polite society, why doesn't that have an effect on them, right? Why doesn't that sink into them and prevent them from doing something like killing Abraham in order to take Sarah? So to answer those, he says, this is Torah v'derech eretz, Torah ma'asim tovim, aval bir ha'inyan hu shema'asim nimtzoim shlosha b'dorim. So let's dig into this a little bit further. So he says, Malacha, kechol ma'aseh tircha hadoresh his rachzus v'yagia yesh bekocha laharchik madam es machshavos hatayva kamramzal mishkachas avon. That indeed, certain activities can really sort of distance ourselves from taiva, from those desires, and it really does help us to forget, to push away the avon, the chet. But this is still very physical. However, at the same time, it's also very possible that it sort of distances ourselves from Torah as well, when we're only engaged in these physical activities in the world, the mundane activities. So Torah v'derech eretz, Torah So how does Torah and derech eretz work together? And he says they have to be interwoven. And he says the example from Rav Chaim Volozhin is that he would say that even the derech eretz has to be Torah itself. What does that mean? What's the example is that? He says, V'zeh l'shono sham Rava Amar l'talmidav biyomi nisan biyomi tishrei lo tischazu kamei ki heichi de lo titardu b'mozachaihu kula shaso. So he gives the example that Rava said to his talmidim in Gemara and Brachos that go away for the days of Nisan, go make your living the days of Tishrei's row, go away because those are the times when you're in the fields doing what you need to be doing in the fields. That's when you make you make your parnasa for the year, and this way you'll make your parnasa, and this way when you come back into the base medrash, you're not going to be completely focused, and you will be completely focused, and you won't be distracted thinking about and worried about how am I going to make my parnasa. So at least in those days, they had the ability to sort of make their parnasa for the year in maybe a couple of different time periods within the year. So they didn't, they weren't necessarily working 40-hour weeks. But the idea there is that even their work in the fields, when they're doing it in order that they should be able to go back into the base medrash and be focused on learning, then even the work that they do in the fields becomes more ruchani. And that's the idea of Torah and Derech Eretz, is that the Derech Eretz has to be done in a way that is also L'gabe Torah. It's not for its own sake at all. Shelo lishma, ma davar ma'asim shelo lishma, yeshnem bezeh shtei madregos. What does it mean when we do it lo lishma? It says, Arishona shelo lishma hazos eres lifnim, Ashneya zu she mesayes lifnim. So there's two different ways to do it. One is that truly, it really sort of contradicts what's going on inside of you. You're just doing an outward activity, but it really contradicts who you are as a person and what you're thinking and feeling inside. And the second is no, it's actually helping what is going on inside of you. And according to the first, that's really what Yeshayahu was talking about. If you're just going through the motions, but internally you don't care, you're not interested, that's not what you're striving to do, then that's where you get into trouble. And that's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Yeshayahu, I'm not interested in their avoda because it's just a shell of an avoda. But the second way is that no, I'm engaging in these activities. Maybe I'm not there yet, but that's where I want to be. That's who I want to be. And that's where it becomes something that is much more helpful for you. And that's what he says, that that's what we need to focus on. That's part of our focus in Elul, is those types of activities that are sort of awaken within us who we want to be and the types of activities we want to be doing. Just sort of moving through this a little bit quicker, just so we can get to Rav Neventzal as well. The last piece he talks about is Yush Soser Yira. And he has a really interesting insight, I think. And he says, for how we're thinking about Elul and, what we're trying to do is to develop within ourselves Yiras Hashem. He says, "Avaba Ozer Sha'ad Nidreshes Gam is Paschus B'Yira Mamish." We're really trying to open up and expand our Yiras Hashem during Elul. And that's how we get to Emas Adin. It says, "V'zehu Geder Emas Adin. Ach tzricha lihios amitis v'amuka v'duras ad tahom nivchin nefesh ha'adam." And he says, Simcha Zissel, the Ultra Mekelm, says, "Amar Shemisha lo ras agon Rav Yisrael Salanter be'Elul lo ra Emas Adin." Right? If you've never seen Rav Yisrael Salanter in Elul time, you don't even know what Emas Adin is. And unfortunately, we don't necessarily we don't have access to see these people, so it's harder for us to do. But what he gets to is there's a problem that sometimes we sort of have this idea that we give up. And he has a really interesting insight that he says that the problem that we face is that it's very easy for us to sort of give up, and that's where the yira just goes away. And the insight that he says is it's interesting if you take soldiers, and before they have to go out to battle, they're scared, they're trembling, you can imagine what's going through their minds. But he said, interestingly enough, once you put them on the front line, like right there, mamish, where the bullets are flying, all of a sudden, at least for most people, the fear goes away, and you just focus on what you need to do. And he says, why is that? Why does the fear just go away? And he says that that's the problem. That actually is yush. You've sort of given up, meaning that I guess you've sort of given up the idea that I don't know that I'm going to live or die. I don't know what's going to be. I just have to do what I'm going to do. But he says that yush that allows you as a soldier to get rid of your fear, relinquish your fear, is also the same yush, which could be certainly a positive in that regard. But when that happens to us in Elul time, it means that we've given up on Yiras Hashem, and we just sort of say what will be, what will be will be. And that's really a dangerous thing that for us. And he really that's sort of goes back to what he was saying before, that the Ma'asim Tovim should be for us to sort of wake us up on the inside to say, this is who I want to be. These are the types of activities I want to engage in. This is the ruchnius I want, and this is how I want to try and prepare myself for Rosh Hashanah, and to try and avoid that yush, that giving up altogether, and saying it is what it is, and I'll do my best, and what'll be will what will be will be. So I just want to stop there. There's something, we only have a few minutes, but I wanted to just share something that Rav Neventzal, he was the Rav of the Old City for probably 20 years or so. He still gives shiurim and yeshivas in the Old City, but so in the sefer of his sichos on Rosh Hashanah, I think he has a great insight for us. Says we'll start up here where it says Lomad Likro Kiraui. It says Anu Omdim Kiyom Bechodesh Elo Muvan She Yeshem Devarim Rabim Lomar. Aval Kimadom Shema Shalom Natzliach LaHasig Al Yedei Hasicha Hatov B'Yoser Nasib B'Tzura Pshuta Im Niftach Iton V'Nikra Es HaKotaras Shabo V'Nikra Kamoshet Tzarich Nikra Ketzad Mis'ar Zaktoras Im Malchus Hashem Ba'olam. He says, when we think about Elul, and sometimes it's hard for us to sort of get into the mode of thinking. He says all you have to do really is open up the newspaper. But he says you have to be careful when you open up the newspaper. You've got to look at the headlines and read them in the right way. Read them in the way where we see Malchus Hashem. He gives an example. This is from the Sikha, I think, was written probably 20 or 25 years ago. But he says, B'mokum likro hamemshala hechlita la'alos es mechira lechem b'margarina. He says, it could be a headline that says that the government has decided to raise the prices of bread and margarine. So instead, you have to read it differently. Nikra berosh Hashanah she'avar nikva. Says, really, it means last Rosh Hashanah, it was set. Shabiyom ploni yalu mechira lechem margarina. That on such and such a date, the price of bread and margarine is going to go up. That's really what the headline is saying. It's not that the government did it. We have to realize that this was set on Rosh Hashanah of last year. Lo nikra tzarfad echlita lesapek kur atomi leIrak. Don't read that it says that France decided to sell to Iraq a nuclear reactor. Ella HaKadosh Baruch Hu hechlit lesapek kur atomi leIrak. Now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that Iraq needs to get a nuclear reactor. Everything that we read about that's happening today, and I thought this was so applicable today, where we're reading so many different things going on in the world around us, and some of them quite scary. But if we look at it and say, all of this was written and sealed from last year, from last Rosh Hashanah. Yamod Shuv Ledim Rosh Hashanah HaKarov. And soon will be the Rosh Hashanah for next year. And Kol Kodoros HaYitonim Shel HaShana HaKrova Tichtavena B'Rosh Hashanah Hazeh B'Shamayim. And all of the headlines for next year are going to be written this coming Rosh Hashanah, and they'll be written in Shemayim. V'tis parsimena me'uchar yoser b'zman ha'irui, and they'll come out. They'll be publicized at the right moment when it all is coming to fruition. This is now the time, right now, to try and prevent those headlines that we don't want to see, right? The headlines that are announcing difficult situations. Those are the ones. That's what we want to try and prevent now. This is the time now to set the price for bread for next year. That's the matzav bichoni and our security situation as well. This is the time to set that. Mispar to unas adrachim rachman al-islan, and all the, unfortunately, people get hurt in car accidents and all those kinds of things. All that is nechta v'nechtam, and it goes into the next couple of paragraphs. The same idea that if we think about like a picture for ourselves, someone standing on the road and seeing a child who's about to get hurt by a car in a car accident, and he doesn't go and do anything to try and rescue the kid. And we think, wow, that's such a cruel person. But he says that's, we have the ability now in our actions and our activities in Elul and then in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur to change those things and to have a better year. Much more difficult to do so, he says, once the Gezerah is already set after Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, much more difficult to try and mevata to negate that. This is the time for us to try and to focus on that and to have a much better year next year. So, a couple of ideas from Dessler of Neventzal that give us a little bit of chizuk in these last days of Elul as we get into Slichos.